I got to wait for my eyes to adjust. I finally figured out, and I get light off this monitor and see those depressions after they adjust. So maybe I won't try to annoy everybody with blanks again. So this is Christian Hoffman of Woodstock, rifle signed on a silver plate, Woodstock, Virginia. And we're in Shenandoah County, looking at early stuff in Shenandoah County, and there's a lot to look at. It's a remarkable group of guns produced there. Okay. There are some details of this rifle. He cut those very meticulous borders on the edges, and he put them over the trigger guard and everything. And usually those borders are cut with a square bottom graver, has a little blade, and you tip it on edge and hammer it and scallop it. And you get so you can do that. If you do it enough, you can look away and think about other things and just keep the rhythm going, hammer and chisel. But Hoffmans are cut by making a straight line first, which you hate to do, because straight lines are the hardest thing to engrave. And then those little chips, instead of running parallel, were cut in at a right angle with a V graver to make that little meticulous. And that's very, very, very rare. And so far, all the examples of it I've seen were in Woodstock or people who learned in that school or the Colonial Williamsburg gun shop where I taught it to a bunch of people, because I think it's really a neat way to do that. But I don't know what his background is, except that he's in Woodstock in 1782. He leaves about 1807. And then one deed around 1807, he sells land, and he's listed as a gunsmith in that deed. And he also participated in making the 1787 colors for the Shenandoah County Militia. For there's two different militia groups in Shenandoah County, and he made the brass finials for the flag staffs, and 7 or 8 Woodstock tradesmen were involved in making those. You know, you see they're making colors, you'd think one flag, but it's a case, and it's shafts and a number of tradesmen. I think the way that worked, the store owner had the contract, and the store owners usually have these contracts. And I think what the store owner does, he gets a contract, he looks at all the outstanding debts, and today you pay. You make this and you make that. And that's the way the cattle industry works too. The store owner collects your cow, puts it into a cow pen, and if he owes you money, you paid that day. Different from today, isn't it? This one turned up in England. It was listed as a American Plains rifle. It's Revolutionary period. It's got some damage out front, you can see, but it's quite a rifle. The patch box on it now is the third one it's had in its life. It started with the sliding wood patch box. Then it had a side opening brass patch box, and the only remnants of that are in the bottom of the door in the cavity, because the brass was inlet below and it got broken off and left a piece of the hinge for a side opening box. And then this was robbed from another rifle, probably Pennsylvania. I don't recognize it as a Virginia box, but this rifle in its working life had 3 different patch boxes. And probably all that occurred during the Revolution. It doesn't have carving behind the cheeks, got a very nice molding, and very fine carving around the tang and the juncture of the comb and wrist there a beautiful shell. And here's the flintlock The borders on this lock are like Hoffman cut them. That's a locally made lock, and it's really high quality. And some of that engraving is similar to Hoffman's, a little stringier, but it's a beautifully made lock. It's so surprising that these guys could turn out things like that during the war, but of course the importation had failed. You couldn't import it anymore. Folding leaf sight. Notice all that corrosion, typical of the British climate. So damp over there. That just rust. That was probably when it turned up was just shaggy with rust. But that's the folding leaf sight. Only the second one on a Virginia rifle I know of, and I think there's only 2 known from Pennsylvania. At the time Kendig did his book, there may have that. There's another sling swivel. This is a rifle from a Alabama grave, believed to have been raided from the Alapaloose, the Creek Kings town or city. I believe it's made by Philip Grandstaff in Woodstock. And I don't know how that order would have been received and all that, but it's a really grand rifle. It was in a burial. Metal detectors raid those places, and they didn't even get the barrel out on this one. Most of the time, the Indians killed the gun by breaking it. The Southern Indians were still doing that practice, the Creek and Chickasaws and the Seminoles. They were still doing grave goods right up through contact. And they would break the rifle by hitting it, the buttstock on a tree. And some of them were hit by hitting the butt plate on that side to break it. Others they hit it at the toe. And so when they hit it at the toe, it breaks away from the trigger guard, whereas if it's hit the other way, it breaks the trigger guard in 3 or 4 pieces. But this one had the trigger guard not broken up. Oh, this one was broken up. I had another one that was hit the other way. Got that confused. But at any rate, and there was so much brass in this that it preserved the wood. Copper sulfate preserves fiber. It kills everything. And so that's the green of the copper when you see it. But, and then it turns over time into bluestone, which is blue. You could buy bluestone, and used to could buy it anyway. And so if you think of modern preserved wood, like fence posts and things like that, have that shady grayish green, that's copper sulfate. And so it preserves and kills everything. And the first time I saw this, it was an Indian burial that the hair was preserved, and each strand had a fine trade bead on every strand. He must have been a really important guy to have that hair. But the hair was preserved because of that. So this one preserved this much of the wood. You can see the relief molding running along the bottom of that. It's curved up because it didn't have enough brass to preserve the whole thing. But that fluted molding's in good shape. This was an exceptional rifle. Let me see if I can get this. Right along here was silver wire, brass wire, and it's in relief now because the copper from the brass preserved the wood, but the brass was completely consumed in the process. And it had carving all up through here, a big volute here. It was a well-carved rifle. The serpents, and when you saw the Hoffman rifle with the 2 inlays there, in 1795, these 2 men were in a partnership in Woodstock. Philip Grandstaff, bought half of Hoffman's lot from him, but Hoffman continued to pay the tax on it, so they were in a partnership. About right at the end of the century, Philip Grandstaff sold that property and built a boring mill for making barrels on Stony Creek. But you can see the two silver wires make the forked tongue of the snake. Can everybody see that? Now the creek's council house held over 200 people. And the trader in 1778 described it in his journal. He was there as a visitor with the Creek King. And he's not tribal, it's a king, okay? The king makes all the decisions. And their fire worship, probably remnants of Cahokia. Anyway, so he says that the council house door is flanked by two coiling, ascending serpents. So Dan Wallace, the researcher in Alabama that wrote me information thinking these guys had robbed us, and he sent me pictures of it, fortunately, out of that site. So we believe that was the king's rifle. But definitely it was in an Indian burial and robbed. Jim Dressler in Indiana got this and owned it for about 25 years. And when he got it, it was much more intact. But he let people handle it, and it lost more and more detail. And so the carving was much more intact at that time. I treated it with an epoxy, low viscosity epoxy, because otherwise it wasn't going to survive at all. And when I did that, some of the carving came out and showed because the cuts were still there in the decayed wood, and that epoxy went in and made it shiny with the cuts for the carving. And this is the part behind the cheek piece up the top. You can see the volute, several volutes. There was more carving there, but that area suffered a lot of losses. The lower butt molding is really quite perfect. And the carving went up under the cheek piece. In different light conditions, I could figure out a lot of this carving. It was a heck of a rifle. Very, very fine rifle. Well, I can't see enough to. Okay. This is the toe that had a brass inlay from the butt plate all the way down. If you recall, the second rifle from Honecker's shop had the chip carving that went the whole distance. And this is in Woodstock, and he was near Front Royal, so this is a predecessor of those full-length brass toe plates. They're happening in Shenandoah County. The brass is all gone, but it preserved the wood around it. This is the escutcheon plate. I first thought that was borrowed from an English fowling piece with the shell and on top of the wrist right behind the barrel tang. But it's got a forged nail that was cast around. It's got a hand-forged square nail, and he put that in the mold and cast it on the head. I've never seen that on a trade gun. So I think he probably made that pattern. Another rifle from Shenandoah County, nice long 48-inch barrel, tapered and flared. That barrel is very close to the one on the brass barrel, but it's iron. It's original flintlock. This patch box, this is a group of pieces that are interrelated with the Hoffman, but they're earlier. The patch box cavity is carved round. The whole cavity is carved round, And so whereas in the standard one you have a rectangular cavity, and then there's a groove for the wooden box to fit in, this one, the wooden box is held by the round edges. It's superior in the woods because it doesn't shrink up and make the, that other one, the box, you can't open those boxes half the time if you're out in the woods on a rainy day, But this solved that problem. But there's a group that ends up being Shenandoah County down to about Rockbridge near Lexington is where this is distributed. And a variation of it George Peterman used in Botetourt in the later period. Original flintlock, very high grip rail away from the stock, a beautiful early rifle. Intricate back plate on that trigger. This is what your pre-revolutionary rifles look like. I love those more than even the more highly decorated ones. The guys on the internet call this the feather rifle because of the carving behind the cheek. But sometimes those iron loops or plates did hold a feather. And the feather was used to put in the touch hole while you're loading to keep from the air pressure pushing powder grains out. And a lot of those feathers had square quills. So there are a few birds of prey that have square quills. And so the square quill would allow the air to go by but not blow the feather out. You pushed it in, and usually they would close that battery on top of that, or the frizzen. And I had an early carved rifle buttstock that had all been destroyed by a guy restocking it. But the toe had two of those square quills still broken off in the toe. It was just a drilled hole in the toe. The brass barrel over there has a 2-inch hole drilled in there for either an awl or a feather. But it's got some wood screw threads, so I think it was an awl.
Before you move on, so that patch box on the other side, when you put the lid in, you hold on to the butt end, if you will, of the patch box lid and slide it under those two edges, and then it's held by friction.
Yeah, the finial goes beyond that, yes. The finial goes on beyond that, yes.
Yeah, so the finial goes.
It overlaps.
The square landing.
Yeah, it overlaps, yeah.
Okay.
That's typical on the regular ones as well as these. And often you'll find remnants of a scribe line around the patch box as they fit it.
Yeah.
They would get it tuned up and then put a scribe line around there.
Okay.
I don't know whether they had a pattern maybe that they were doing that ahead of time, but
Thank you.
this is the tang carving on this rifle. And this sort of feather-like, see how that overlaps the other underlying? And there's some instances of that on the Hoffman rifle. This one's the oldest of the lot, and it's not a full round. It's starting and has a partial round bottom, but it's not quite as developed. And this brass trigger guard is clearly an iron pattern. The cheek piece has lost a lot of height because of some either mouse damage. When I first saw this, it had been already rasped down like that, but it was a very high cheek piece. Here's the trigger guard in the front, and those moldings are cast in, and in a couple places, the flash hasn't even been removed with the file. It's the cast. And you can see that was an iron pattern. It's so thin. And this is the beginning of a group that the spur on the grip rail turns toward the front rather than scrolling on the back, the grip rail of the guard. And this is the earliest. Also, that tang is the earliest one of those. I used to think those were all Tennessee late, that swollen sort of arrow point tang. But here's a piece that's clearly early pre-revolutionary rifle. And it's I think it's 53 caliber. Now the nose piece is original, and he made this out of a sheet of brass, bent it around, and then hammer raised it so that it turned over the rim toward the outside. And then he soldered the second level to close that cap, and it emulates the horn caps that they did in Europe. A lot of work in that. This rifle had been unmercifully refinished, where the guy filed things down and really hurt it. This is the one I fell in love with at Kindig's in 1964. And I put it behind the door where he had other guns stacked so I could try to get it later. And Earl Lanning in North Carolina found it and bought it. Then it went to Harley McIntosh, then to Jay Hopkins, and I finally got ownership in the late 90s. But it took a long time. But it's wonderful tapered and flared barrel. And this is the prototype for Kibler's kit. When he took my class, and I owned that, and I had that at the class. That exaggerated thin wrist is related to Indian trade guns. They're starting to have an effect on, because a lot of whites are buying the cheap Indian trade guns. They're not just going to Indians. And they're much lighter weight and often have this kind of exaggerated thin elements like that. But that's a beautiful rifle. Kibler says it's unclear where it was made. He doesn't really want to say it's Shenandoah County because then some of his Pennsylvania customers might want to buy it. Funny how money changes things. Sorry, Jim. It's something I would say to his face, I'll tell you that. Here's a picture of that bottom. It's hard to photograph, but you can see that's curving around and the shadow's right in the middle of that. And there's the tang carving. And oh, I remember I sold that to Giles Cromwell when it left me. He was saying, "When are you going to sell me that rifle? It has a stock about this thick." Those lock screws are about to fall out. This is in Windsor Castle. And when you look at the patches in that patch box, you see the edges of the patches go out under it's a round bottom. You can see it. If it had a wall there, those patches would have to be bent. And this has got carving closely related with Christian Hoffman. And it's a wonderful early rifle. That's pictured in Shumway's Rifles of Colonial America. That picture shows how that patch is behind and you wonder if, and the side plate, while it's kind of a generic one, it's really identical to Hoffman's outline specifically. And I think I don't have a good photograph of that carving, although Now we moved to Saumsville. It's a small community in Shenandoah County. This guy's work I love. It's just absolutely phenomenal. Godfrey Wilkin. Most interesting personality. Feathery carving. The trigger guard is Adam Haymaker's pattern. John Haymaker's pattern is different from Adam's. By the time John was making rifles, they had upgraded the earlier style. Everybody with me? They were changing it to being more in style with moving lighter things. But this one is identical. It right off the, even got a shadow of the hole for the sling. There's a shadow for the sling hole. His original had a sling. Now, how this happens, the apprentice, when he finishes his apprenticeship, appears to have been making a rifle in the shop, carrying that with him, and then casting the mounts from that. And so as time goes on, because of shrinkage ratios and filing, the guards get smaller and smaller. I see some guys understand. I hope that's, but I think it's a practical thing that was going on. The guy goes home with a rifle with all the parts he needs to as the patterns. And a lot of Shenandoah County ones have a wear plate on the edge of the cheek piece, and it's usually engraved. This carving is beautifully done. That has a full-length brass toe plate and a full-length comb piece. That's somewhere still in the family. I got to photograph it in the late 60s. About 81, I went and tried to buy it. And the old man and his wife were having tea on the porch. You know, it's a country place. You always go to the back door, not the front. And I walked up and talked to them through the screen and reminded them that I'd come and photograph that rifle. And I said, I've got $20,000, I'd like to buy it. And the old man looked at me and he said, well, you can look at those pictures. Good day. Good day. I was done. I didn't even get it on the porch. And it was supposed to be willed to some guy in Stanton who was a preacher, and that guy wrote Colonial Williamsburg and donated $1 and then tried to sell it before the man was dead. And of course, the president sent that to me, you know. But it's a great, great rifle. That's about 1795. There's the earliest long tang. It's all over Tennessee, North Carolina, Southwest Virginia. And you can't say that it's a repair because it's relief carved all the way around it. So many of these features that are rampant in Carolina and so forth originate in Shenandoah County. The use of silver combined with brass, all these are seeds that grow all the way down the line. It's a pretty wonderful rifle. Have no idea where it is. This is a signed Godfrey Wilkin. It has a Simon Locke signed barrel. And I think it probably happened because the customer brought a barrel to be stocked. And the gun's been misunderstood for years because of that. But right in the front of the lock, it's got Godfrey Wilkin's name. The set trigger bed is engraved. Even the curved trigger is engraved, and it's got Wilkin's initials on the set triggers. And let's see. These two strips right beside the box, I got to try to get steady here. Now you see my heartbeat. Those two strips are silver. John Haymaker paneled his doors sometimes with that box panel around it. And the engraving on that door is a simplification of the more leafy versions we've been looking at in Simon Locke and Haymakers. But that's a classic Haymaker. And adjacent to the door hinge, can everybody see those sort of crow tracks? Those are cut with a radius bottom graver. And that's exactly the way John Haymaker cut them. Same tool, same exact. And of course, the double C-scroll on either side and that formula of boxes. So Wilkin was in the Haymaker shop. It had to be in the early 80s during the war. I didn't know that anybody was doing pierced side plates on a patch box during the Revolution, but that's when he's there. Yes?
Is that dogwood motif common? It looks like a dogwood flower to me.
You'll have to speak real loud.
I said the dogwood flower, is that a common motif? I don't think I've seen that.
That's the most classic finial for Shenandoah Valley, and it's used in other places. There was a thing that went around years ago that somebody called it an Edelweiss, and the Edelweiss doesn't look like that at all. It actually looks like one of the hybrid dogwoods today that has that spiral, the flower turning in all directions. You see variations of it. This particular box is more refined than most, and the C-scrolls are well delineated. It's just a real good understanding of the design. But this is a phenomenal rifle. It dates to 1806. That's when the eclipse of the sun was visible in Shenandoah County. And so that plate says sun eclipse. And it's silver, and you can see the eclipse starting at the top of the head there where the brass is taking a... Everybody see that? That's brass, where it's showing the eclipse of the sun. I think I've got a close-up of this cheek side. See the alternating scallops attached to the butt plate? The second one down has 2 rivets in it. That's the patch box release. That's clever. I love that rifle. And look at all those borders and engraving. This man died in 1812. He had, I think it was 13 pages of inventory. He had gunsmithing stuff. He had 11 unfinished grindstones and stoneworking tools, a 1/4 ton of plaster of Paris and window sashes. He had crops in the fields. And I valued all the different crops and the spelt and different things. He had a leather working shop and all those weather tools. He had several apple mills in progress, plain stocks, not finished. It just goes on. And he had 10-plate stoves, and you can kind of see when you go from one room to the other. And in the Ford Museum, there's a related blanket chest to this rifle. And Joe Kindig bought it out of the valley back in the 1940s. It's a OG foot blanket chest. Has, let's see, 2 drawers on the bottom. And it's got panels in the front and with a couple heart piercings. And I'm trying to remember, it's got a top line on the style that's right under the eave of the molding of the top. So it has a top typical of a blanket chest. Let's see. 18, Godfrey Wilkin, Hardy County, State of Virginia, 04. And that's carved letters with putty inlay, that classic German putty inlay. And it's got another inscription across the bottom, and then a style going this way. It says, read this up, and on the end it's got a style and it says, well done. And then you can pull out 2 drawer supports on either side of that double drawer bottom. The whole front drops down and exposes 7 more drawers underneath. And I used to think that was his. I think I did publish that in Mazda one time, that he had made that. But it turned out he's his nephew. And the Wilkin family was there somewhat before the French and Indian War in the Shenandoah Valley. But it's sometimes I think I remember something in that inventory. It takes so long to read it, I forget what I was looking for because it's so entrapping. He had livestock. Oh, he had a turning lathe and lathe tools. So he must have been employing a huge amount of employees, or I don't know. It's really quite a group of stuff. This is somewhat related to Philip Grandstaff. This is one of my favorite rifles, and actually, my friend Eve down here loves this one as well. Now here you've got a guy that's struggling with engraving, but it's really effective. And there's a different flower. It looks like very hastily shaped, but well engraved. And in Shenandoah County, these 4-petaled, more like a dogwood, flower around the screws. See, they have that wavy line out in their crotches like that. That's used by a number of makers in Shenandoah County in variations. Godfrey Wilkin put an arrow coming out of those, like a little arrowhead on it. Kind of details you love to see and study. This is the part to love most, that beaded and fluted molding. That carving is just breathtaking. I remember back when there was only like 2 known Virginia rifles with carving. And then, they were saying it was all made in Pennsylvania. These guys really got cheated by that. Last I knew where this was, a colonel in D.C. owned it. I don't know whether he's still alive or not. J. Grandstaff. Philip Grandstaff had several children who were in the business. When he was doing contracts with the state, he had at least 10 or 11 employees in his shop, and he wrote the governor with the list because the Army was coming by and drafting them for the War of 1812, and he's trying to finish a government contract. So typical government deal, right? But thank goodness he had that problem because it gave us a list, and we know. And so it was a lot of his family in there. And Peter Seitz, I think I mentioned him before. Peter Seitz was his locksmith, and Peter Seitz was out of Harrisonburg, but he was up here in Berkeley County before he was down with Grandstaff, and I think he had learned to make a lot of tricks at Harper's Ferry about making locks, because he's making 30 locks in 1 year, and I sure could never do that with all that handwork, He knew something that we haven't learned. But there's two John Grandstaffs. One died in 1834, and one dies later in the 1850s. And Philip's the father of some of them. And then there's a Jonathan Grandstaff also. So again, you don't know who's the author of each one. But I love that stylized bird finial and the wire around it. It's just a really neat patch box. Everybody see the bird's beak and little influenced by Godfrey Wilkin, would you say, with the saber? This one's in the Mazda collection in Winston-Salem. And Sally Gant, who worked there for years, was a Grandstaff descendant, so it was kind of neat. Did you know that? You knew Sally, though. More of a Winchester finial. I found George's signature and couldn't read the German. But he set up a boring mill and a wool card machine. And it was on Stony Creek. And when he got the rifle contract, he added 6 feet to his mill dam. And the pond washed into Blackford and Arthur's Ironworks, and they weren't very happy about it. And so they went to court. And the court appointed surveyors, and they resurveyed it and made Grandstaff take his dam down to a lower level. And I've been fortunate enough to own several Grandstaff rifles and one stoveplate from Blackford and Arthur. A 10-plate stoveplate had Blackford and Arthur, and then scrolls and carved stoveplate. That side plate, by the way, with those piercings is very classic in many. The Spitzer shop, which is below the Grandstaffs down in Newmarket. That's a very typical one. It seems to have been derived roughly from a Ketland pistol type. This is a Grand rifle that has not been published much. Early. I think it's Rockbridge County. Steve Hinch thinks it's Reading, but of course, everything's Reading up there these days. But this is definitely a George Peterman bird box based on the Honeckers. And that's the earlier rifle. You notice that side plate with that kind of spike, and up at the top, his top side plate repeats that. There's that little OG curve and a spike. I'll try to get this thing on without darkening the entire room. It's right in ours. Now that's partly the breeze moving the screen, okay? I remember going to Antiques Forum and these guys get nervous and it's going all over. But at any rate, so that's really the same motif, just a bigger version of it here. And this is all closely associated with Abraham Honecker, and I don't know, Frederick Honecker, who's over in what's now Monroe County, West Virginia, died in 1824. He was the third son of Hans Jacob, and he had a state contract, so we know he was a very active gunmaker. But that deer rifle it's probably late Rev War. Since the long rifle in many ways exists as a type because of deer hunting and deerskin trade, You seldom see the deer on the rifles. There's a few in Lancaster that have a carved deer behind the cheek piece, but this is just wonderful. That deer's body is convex and shaped, and you can't see it in these slides, but it was silvered. The deer was silvered, and his antlers are silver wire, and it's so much like the Spittler clock. If y'all know the Spittler clock, and Jeff Evans uses that hanging cupboard as his, because he sold it. Actually, I'd walked on up those steps and around it and didn't know that, even the owner didn't tell me that was under the steps in the door space. But the day I was there, I got to see the 1727 Bible and hold it. And it was published in Nuremberg in 1594. And those Baroque spandrels on the brass on each side that have been hammered out, they were worn down on the holes. And inside that, we said, do you have any old birth certificates? I was photographing the tall clock that identified the Spittler group. And I used a 4x5 old view camera. And Don Walters asked him about birth certificates, and he said, we might find something like that. And so he come downstairs with that big Bible and flips it over, and here are these Proctor in there, partly done, some of them partly folded. And absolutely the best Proctor in Winterthur, that was always said the best Pennsylvania one on the cover there, it was done by Spittler in Shenandoah County. And here was the proof with all the stuff in the Bible. And then he took us down and showed us the tombstones of the people and so forth. We found that because it was mentioned in a 1930 history, being in a certain family. So we went into Lou Ray, and I held the bag of quarters and handed them to Don and read the phone numbers. And we found it in 2 hours. And they said, sure, come on by. We went in that house and about fainted. I mean, you just don't find that every day, do you? Look at that molding on the cheek piece. Now, he's really bluffing it in carving. He's really reaching out on that. What a rifle. Look at that inlay. That's a Spitzer rifle on the bottom with sheet and wire inlay, and there's about 20 or 30 versions of that. And Henry Spitzer set up his shop in 1794 in Newmarket. Henry Spitzer and his father lived east of Lexington in the 90s. And he and his wife were Lutherans all their life, but they got married at Timber Ridge Church with James Houston, the pastor, the cousin of James Houston of Texas fame. That family came out of there. And there at that Timber Ridge Church right north of Lexington is a monument to Houston, Texas, and all that. And the best gravestone in Virginia, as I've seen, is in that churchyard. It's really fantastic. It's a life-size coffin with heart-shaped ends on the foot, pecked and heart-shaped. And it's John Mackey. And at the bottom it says Nathaniel Evans, builder. And there's another stone that he did for his wife, and I've seen him in records. And then it's got that mortality. Remember, man, as you pass by, as you are now, once was I, as I am now, soon you will be. Think often of eternity. It's just a beautiful stone. And I was there measuring it one time for the cabinet makers, for Mac Headley. and the pastor walked by and says, go make one for you? Well, that might be true. I actually offered to help them and give them a donation to put that inside the church and make one to the weather. We don't have space, right? Those things are all melting and going away. It's just a shame. I had a meeting with them out there, and I was going to give them $5,000 to start it. People are hard to figure out, especially they don't like strangers. Country people don't like strangers. This is Henry's. The name on that is C. Kelsey, the silver inlay. And C. Kelsey lived in Lexington. And Henry Spitzer left in 1794 from the tax records down there, and then it's in Newmarket. He made this gun in 1794 in Newmarket because it says Newmarket made on a silver plate. And it's H. Spitzer in block letters. And Charles Kelsey had a child in the fall of 1794 in Kentucky. And so this gun was made before he moved to Kentucky. And that's a pattern I've seen in other areas. And the neighborhoods had parties, seeing people off to Kentucky. The neighbors would get together and have a party. It's a really interesting phenomenon, but this rifle dates to 1794, and it's got haymaker stuff, the long toe plate and so forth. So the family's from York, Pennsylvania. But it turns out that when he moved to Newmarket, it was his uncle that paid for the lot. So Bill Bowers, in his book, thought that he had a wife that died and married rapidly, but he was a schoolmaster, the uncle Henry Spitzer. So there's 3 or 4 Henry Spitzers. And I was into an account book of the Hinkle store in Newmarket. And that's now unknown where that account book is. And that's what helped me figure out all that, because he had problem with the Henry Spitzers also. So and the schoolmaster went to the Davidson Church and all that. But so Henry bought a lot himself, and then the schoolmaster sold the lot that Henry and Henry's father was on. So complicated thing. People are complicated. Tax records don't always tell you everything. But John Sheets was doing regular business in Newmarket for his supplies at Hinkle's store. He lives in Stanton. That's a ways. He even sent apprentices up there to get medicines, and he was buying crucibles for casting and other things from the Hinkle store. I think that's the German community. He might not have been able to get credit in Stanton, because he moved there in 96. It might have taken a while, but anyway, those are interesting things to try to unravel. This gun was restocked probably by someone trained in Winston-Salem. But there's a variation of that side plate I cited earlier. There's a full-length toe plate with haymaker-inspired engraving. The lock is signed H and K, and I've been trying to figure out for years who that is, because they turn up in mainly in the Northern Valley, Maryland, and the lower edge of Pennsylvania on various rifles. And they often have this rounded molding at the back. Kindig first pointed this out to me in the 1960s, and other than I found several more that are signed, I haven't figured out who's supplying those locks, but it's some local supplier. Hope one of you guys run into something that figures it out. These guys were so prolific. I love the little hearts under the cheek piece. Jacob Lindemuth apprenticed to them. He served in the War of 1812 and almost didn't make it. And then he set up a boring mill. And his contract on the boring mill forbade him from using it as a grist mill. He could only use it for doing the barrels. the owner wanted to keep the gristmill income. 1811. Lindemood made some extraordinary rifles and there's that chip carving from the brass barrel influence there in Newmarket. A lot of the moldings in Shenandoah County stop short of going past that rear thimble. And this is a nice way it's handled with the wavy line. And you can see that that's a brass draw loop with a silver head. That's a wonderful patchbox finial. He made one even better than that. It's very, very rococo. Pretty impressive rifle. 1901. This is my last set of slides I'm showing you. So those of you will be in relief that I'm going to stop talking here soon. But every one of those is a flintlock rifle. I met the man who identified everybody in that and had targets that are marked. And he told me, he said, my ancestors were big men and their hobby was brawling and target shooting. And then he showed me on one of the targets, told me all the people, and 2 of them had died in brawls in Woodstock. In Newmarket. One of them got hit and his head hit the concrete curb. Every one of these guns is a flintlock. They believed that flintlocks were better. That rifle was named Bull of the Woods. I got to handle that rifle, and it's in the hands of one of the guys standing there. And I got to handle that bag and horn, which the guy on the right's wearing it. All this has got kept. It's just phenomenal. I asked him, why didn't they use different boards for that target backstop? They're shooting at 200 yards. From a rest with a fork on the ground from prone. I've got a picture somewhere of that. This is the target from 200 yards. And it's chunk gun shooting where you have the paper and you put your X behind where your rifle's going to hit. And it's covered up. You shoot at the whole paper. And so there were so many holes in that board, they carved a corn cob down and drove it in there and cut it off level to keep using the same board. And it looked like it had been a step or something out of. But when you have the pictures of him, I've got some wide. There's not a tree in sight, as far as you can see. Wood was so rare out there. The valley had been stripped. The top of the mountains were grazing lands. Everything was just stripped. But that's one of the rarest things, and I usually wasn't interested in this period, but you drop your jaw when you walk in. The guy's got stacks of targets from 1901 with all these people's names and everything. And I still don't know where chunk gun shooting got it. Those rules were set up. It may be something that came from Europe. But it's really weird because at that range in this little bitty spot where your rifle's going to, that piece of paper is a dot when you're shooting at it at that range. And some of them had the long shades, iron sight shades. Well, I've enjoyed it. I hope I haven't killed you too much with too many details.